It is 12:01 p.m. Eastern Time, so I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar, Leveling Up Your Workforce Through Disability Inclusion. I'm Kayla Kovac-Galton, the Curriculum and Programming Manager at the Diversity Movement. Today's webinar is moderated by our Head of Content and Programming, Jackie Ferguson, Certified Diversity Executive, Forbes contributor, and host of the Diversity Beyond the Checkbox podcast. In today's webinar, we'll review the business benefits of prioritizing disability inclusion in the workplace, share best practices for disability etiquette, and explore accessibility and assistive technologies. And finally, announce the launch of our new course, Disability Inclusion, Putting Untapped Talent to Work. Before we get started, we have a quick 2-question poll for you all that I will go ahead and launch now. All right, wonderful. So I'm going to end the poll and share the results with you all. So looks like we have quite a variation in what you're all interested in. Luckily, we'll cover that all today. So thank you again for sharing that. That poll will help us inform our future educational resources and consulting focus. Please remember to share your participation in this webinar by tagging the Diversity Movement and Abler on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and use the hashtag TDMWebinars. All right, let's jump right into our program. Jackie, the mic is yours.
Kayla, thank you so much. I appreciate that. I am so glad to be here with you all today and so excited to be hosting this conversation between two of my favorite CEOs, Donald Thompson, co-founder and CEO of the Diversity Movement. Donald was recently named to the Forbes Next 1000 and has been named to the Inc. 5000 fastest growing companies for Walk West 3 times since taking over the helm. Donald is a certified diversity executive, speaker, investor, and advisor for organizations of all sizes in industries where inequities among underrepresented people are prevalent, from healthcare to banking to tech and more. He's also a mentor for Google for Startups, Black Founders Exchange, and Donald's book, Underestimated, A Black CEO's Journey to Success, is due out at the end of August this year. And we have John Samuel, co-founder and CEO of Abler, a disability inclusion and accessibility business focused on removing the barriers that have hindered people with disabilities from accessing education, retail, entertainment, and employment. John's passion for his work is very personal and wants to make sure the obstacles that he's faced, being blind, are removed for others. Over the past 15 years, John has held leadership roles domestically and internationally. John holds an MBA from George Washington University and a degree in accounting from North Carolina State University. In 2019, John was selected to the Triangle Business Journal's 40 Under 40 and the Business Journal's Influencers Rising Stars, a national list of 100 young influential business leaders. He also serves on the board of directors of Aravind Eye Foundation, the world's largest eye care provider. Welcome. We've got an packed hour and I've got lots of questions, but we'll try to get to your questions for those that are joining us on the webinar in the Q&A towards the end of the webinar. So feel free to drop in your questions at any time, but let's jump into some questions. So for each of you, can you take a moment and tell us about the diversity movement and Abler from your perspective and what each of them do? And Don, I'll start with you.
Sure, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here, and John and I go way back, so it's just great to participate in anything that we're doing together. So when I think about the diversity movement and explaining it to others, it's very simple. We help organizations and individuals think about diversity, equity, inclusion in a practical way that impacts their business, and we do that through e-learning modules, we do that through training, and we do that through technology applications.
John?
Thank you. And thank you both. Again, Jackie, you mentioned Donald and I being two of your favorite CEOs. You two have been a big part of my career, and I'm so thankful to be here. But thinking about Abler, there's three things that we're really trying to do, and these come from my own personal experiences and what we need to do to get people jobs and remove those barriers for people. And so what we're doing is eliminating the digital divide, which we do through accessibility services. We're changing the mindsets of organizations and people, what we're doing through our course and our consulting. And then we're creating pathways for employment for people with disabilities. And we're doing this through Abler Works, which is a workforce development program. And so our hope is that through these three different pillars, we can improve the lives for people of all abilities.
Awesome. So how did the two of you meet, and how did you go from associates to friends? And John, I'll start with you.
No, it's a great one, because this is something I talk about quite often, because when I moved back to North Carolina in 2017, I was looking for jobs, and a friend of mine, Ed Summers, had told me, he's like, "Oh, you should reach out to all these diversity and inclusion programs because they're looking for diverse talent." And at the time, I wasn't open about my vision loss, and so I thought this was an opportunity for me to talk about my disability and to reach out to companies who I thought were looking for diverse talent like myself. But as I was reaching out to these different companies and programs, I wasn't getting any callbacks. There wasn't a single email or a single call. And I just felt like I just didn't fit a box that they were trying to check off. And so I ended up landing on my feet, working with LCI, the largest employer of Americans who are blind, which is based right here in Durham. But, when I had the opportunity, we were with the Raleigh Chamber. They were launching their first diversity, equity, and inclusion conference. And I had the opportunity to join the task force and also speak at the conference. But what I realized was that often the case, I was the only person at the table who was really focused on the business. There's a lot of people who are really focused on the compliance side. And so, that was kind of the situation at the time in 2017, 2018. And so I was at a tech conference in Durham, and I heard Donald speaking about about tech and diversity and inclusion. And it was the first time that I had heard another person talking about diversity and inclusion in the context of business, the way that I thought of it. And he offered to meet anyone for coffee, and I jumped at the opportunity. And then he graciously met me for coffee at Carolina Cafe over in Cary.
Yeah, I mean, I remember that vividly. And one of the things is, as a speaker, as an author, I always offer the opportunity for people to connect with me. Not everyone does, and that's okay. I'm not looking for more to do. But those that do reach out are some of the most powerful relationships that I've ever had. And when I talked with John, I saw a leader emerging that more people needed to know. And I was curious, I was open, because I always appreciate relationships where I can give, but I also can learn a bunch. And that's what I felt in meeting John.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. John, can you tell us a bit more about your story and how navigating the world changed for you as your sight changed?
Yeah, so I'm originally born and raised here in North Carolina. And but when I was in college is when I started to realize that something was going on with my eyes. And so I had lived in a sighted world, driving, doing all the things that any other sighted kid was doing. But I was walking into a lot of things, and I was starting to get hurt. And that's when I got checked out by the doctors, and I was diagnosed with a degenerating eye condition called retinitis pigmentosa. And I was told I was going blind. And as a young person, it was devastating. And in my actions, things I was just trying to kind of hide from it. And my actions led to me failing out of college, and just like went down a kind of a dark space because I just wasn't open about it. I didn't want people to know. I was ashamed and embarrassed, and because I didn't know anyone who had a disability. So because I didn't have any experience with other people, it just felt like I was this outsider, and I didn't want anyone to know. And so I ended up graduating from college. I ended up getting out of North Carolina because I didn't think anyone who was blind or had a disability could really live here in North Carolina and have a career. And so I left and I moved to Bangor, India, because I thought I could get a car and driver. Then after a couple years in India, I moved to New York, and then went out to Africa, where I started up a telecom company. And throughout this time, I was still embarrassed to tell people that I was losing my sight, because I thought companies would think it was a liability. But as my company saw, it was something we never talked about, but it was something that they knew of. I went to grad school, and that was the first time that I met somebody who was the associate dean. She was the first person who could empathize with what I was going through, because she had a child with special needs, and she encouraged me to be open about my vision loss. And so I was open about my vision loss with my classmates, and that's how I felt I could be my true self and open up my heart. And I met my wife in the MBA program. But I was still scared that companies were going to see it as a liability. So when I was applying for jobs, I wasn't disclosing it. And so it was still something I was ashamed of, even though I was good with talking to my friends now and being more open about it in my personal life. I just didn't feel companies were ready. And so that's what's really kind of influenced and shaped my whole perspective on what disability inclusion is, because it really took me accepting and coming out of the closet a blind person, that I then understood and realized that it was, I had to make sure that no one else felt that way. And that really came when I joined LCI. And that's when I realized that I could do something. I have a platform that I can remove the barriers so that no other 17, 18-year-old kid who's living here in North Carolina and losing their sight doesn't have to think that they can't have a career, doesn't think that they can live here in one of the best places in the country to live. Why shouldn't they have the opportunities right here in our hometown? And that's what's driven me to do what I do now.
John, so well said. Thank you for sharing that. John, you often say that proximity builds empathy. For both of you, what does that mean, and how does that apply to inclusion at large?
I'll kind of play on this because, as I talked about when I first started losing my sight, I think that because I didn't have proximity to anyone else, it took me 17 years until I met my first executive with a disability who was blind, and that was Ed Summers over at SAS. And that was a serendipitous meeting for me to meet him on the road. If you haven't heard, I can tell you that story later on. But it took me meeting this random person on the road to be able to realize that you could be blind and have have a meaningful career. And so that proximity to Ed, and then coming to LCI and being in this organization that had people with different abilities at all different, working in different jobs, and that really was what helped me think about that idea of proximity builds empathy. I didn't have empathy until I had proximity to this community, and I think that translates to a lot of different groups. And I'd love to hear Don's perspective on that.
For me, and John, thanks for that space. It's really about breaking down those mental barriers we have to things that are not our own personal experience. Mm-hmm. And my relationship with John, for example, allowed me to now think more clearly about the things that I take for granted, right? I have a lot of friends that are Asian Indian because one of my companies was bought by a company based out of Pune. That experience of working with people from another culture, another part of the world, allowed me to see things, understand things, be more empathetic. So you can think about it from a cultural standpoint, a geography standpoint, or a disability inclusion standpoint. Most of us have our own little bubble, our own little silos that shape, right, the way that we see and act. Mm-hmm. But that level of empathy increases when we are exposed to people that are different from us. And I'm better for it. And I think the one point that I would make is because of my expanded relationships, I now have a much broader context as a marketer, as a diversity and inclusion consultant, right? As a father, as a husband, to be better because I have these different influences that make me stronger.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's so true. Don, you've been CEO of multiple companies. You serve on boards for several organizations. You're an investor, you're an advisor. Why do business leaders need to understand and prioritize disability inclusion in the workforce?
So let's think about the numbers of why you should care, and then let's talk about the morality of it, right? The numbers, 43 million professionals with disabilities are unemployed or underemployed. These leaders, emerging leaders, are consumers. They consume technology. They are buying homes and cars and things of that nature for their families. They are also talented emerging leaders in your organization. And so if you're limiting your search and cutting out 43 million people, then how can you be hiring the best people? If you're trying to sell a product and build your marketing presence, but you're eliminating 43 million people because your website is not digitally accessible, from a business standpoint, you're limiting your opportunity for growth. When you now take a step back and think about social equity, when you think about social justice, we want the world that we live in to have a base level human decency component that applies to all. We want to give each other the opportunity to have that American dream that we all hold up, right, as the standard, but in actuality, it's not yet true for all of our citizens. That reality means that we have a responsibility to do something about it. And so for business leaders, you have the monetary aspect of 43 million consumers that you want to reach to sell more product. That's fine. But then we have the right thing to do mode, which is we need to make sure that that American dream applies to all. The other thing that I'll tell you, there's an Accenture study, because I like data, case studies. Businesses that are truly leaning into disability and inclusion have a 28% higher revenue than their peers. So the numbers say you should pay attention.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and Jackie, I'd like to hop on one more number that really gets me kind of jazzed. It's Gartner, which is one of the big IT research firms. They predict by 2023 that the percentage of people with disabilities in the workforce is going to triple. That's only 2 years away.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we think about that the number of people with disabilities is going to triple, we talk about COVID being this terrible thing, but in some ways, the silver lining about it has been the fact that we've been able to make these jobs, a lot of jobs, done from home. And that removes the transportation barrier, just like the reason why I left the US to go to India was because of transportation. Now, if I can have a disability, not be able to drive, I can do my job from home. That's going to open up a lot of new opportunities. And so this is just it's a wave that's coming, and we just need to be ready for it. So I'm super excited about that.
Absolutely. And, just the effects of this pandemic with so many negative things, right? The one positive, John, as you said, that's come out of it is flexible work schedules and working from home, which is so impactful for professionals who have disabilities, whether they are invisible disabilities, chronic illness. They've been advocating for work from home for a long time, and companies didn't think they'd be able to do it. But here we are now with this new way of working that's really opened up the opportunity to employ the best and the brightest, which includes professionals with disabilities. So thanks for sharing that. John, it's been a goal of yours to create a disability inclusion course. Why did you choose to partner with the diversity movement to create it? And can you tell us about it?
Yeah, this has been a long time coming. Before the stay at home, and I remember hearing about the diversity movement before it even launched, and the plans for Beyond the Checkbox, and it was something I really wanted to be part of. And so I remember talking to Donald about this, and Kurt and yourself, Jackie, as you were building out the curriculum and content. And you were really, at that time, you were being intentional to make sure that you included people with disabilities. But when I think about the disability inclusion, there's actually this cultural component and there's a functional component. And so, I loved what y'all had done with the Beyond the Checkbox. And what I wanted to do was create a program that seamlessly integrated into Beyond the Checkbox. So it's a seamless experience for participants going through it, but then it could also be a standalone product. And so if we wanted to do this, there was no better partner than to go to the source of the Beyond the Checkbox. And so it was almost this natural kind of, I wanted to emulate that kind of experience, because one of the things that you did with Beyond the Checkbox that really got me excited was you used actual people's voices. And so, when we think about disability inclusion, often the case, it may be, we're not sharing the actual stories, because I realize that what's most impactful is when I talk to people and I share my story, if we could bring other people's voices with different experiences, different backgrounds into a course, it could really add a new layer of the training, not just the educational content you're going to get from the class, but you're going to get it from actual people's mouth and their experiences. And that thing is a much more holistic and well-rounded training experience. And so it really came down to that. And, this started a year ago, the idea, there's a lot of people who were part of this, Suzanne Meyer on the team, and then and Morgan Cates from the Abler side, and then yourself, Jackie, who've been just so gracious with your expertise, and Kayla, Roxanne, Jamie. What people don't realize, it took a village to put this thing together. It genuinely was, and I'm so thankful for everyone who was part of this.
One thing I'll add on the course, e-learning is really important because everyone learns differently. And so live training is great, right? But a lot of times people need that psychological safety. So we wanted to put a disability inclusion course together, obviously Abler's brainchild, so that we could also scale, right? So that thousands of people could get this information, share it within their companies and organizations, and create readiness for people to have more thoughtful conversations, right, about disabilities.
Absolutely. So let's get into a little bit of disability etiquette. And based on the poll that Kayla put out to the group a little earlier, this was one of the top things that people wanted to talk about. So let's dive into that. For both of you, let's talk about some of the rules of disability etiquette. What do we all need to know?
Yeah, I can jump in here real quick with a couple. I see this quite often when I go out to dinner with my wife. And it's funny because I didn't know it was happening because I couldn't see the person. But often people would be talking to my wife about things that I may need or want, right? So it's important to talk to people, not about people, just about people or talking around people, right? Remember, it kind of goes back to that people first. We're people first, the disability is second. And so when we think about it that way, kind of remembering that, and that, that is something that is really important. So even whether it be somebody who's blind who may not be able to see you, talking to that individual, whether it be talking, somebody who's using a wheelchair, sit down in a seat next to them and talk to them rather than talking down to the person. So it's really kind of making sure that we're talking even eye to eye with everybody. And I think that kind of goes to not just disabilities, but to anybody.
Absolutely, John.
One of the things that I had to learn, and John, I appreciate this so much, is not make assumptions, right? Just because someone has a disability does not mean that they need your help in the moment. So you have to be thoughtful, right? And ask, right? Just like I would if somebody had 2 sets of groceries in their hand, may I assist you, right? They may or may not want that help, right? But my job is just to be thoughtful and offer, but not to assume, because sometimes that could make someone feel less than. The other thing that I thought about, and I'm in the learning mode here, right? One of the reasons I'm so excited about this process of diversity, equity, inclusion and the diversity movement is because every single day I'm learning to be better. And so what I want to share with people that are listening is having all the answers, being perfect is not a prerequisite. It's just the way that we come across to try to be thoughtful and learn and empathetic, but responding gracefully to requests. If somebody has the courage and the thoughtfulness to ask for an accommodation, then what we need to reciprocate is now being thoughtful in how to address that accommodation, right? Because now we're in a dialogue that is going to have a lasting impact of the way that individual or couple or family feels about the business that you're representing, feels about the church that you're a part of, feels about the school that you're representing, right? And how we make those accommodations is really, really important, that we're helpful, right? But we don't make people feel less than because they need something applied a little bit differently.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And that accommodation goes into a lot, right? I think it's a good transition because, people think accommodations and things you have to do are expensive and it's difficult. But when you really think about it, it's not too much. to give somebody a really good user, like a good experience. And I think it goes back to just remember, we're all people at the end of the day, and we all want to be treated equal.
That's exactly right. And the one thing that I'll add is just for everyone to remember that two people with seemingly identical conditions may have vastly different experiences. They may, use different identity descriptors. They might need different degrees of assistance. So back to not making assumptions, only the person with that disability knows what they need, knows what they can or cannot do. So, just be thinking about that. And John, 100% agree with people first. That's good to remember with inclusion in general. So thank you for sharing that.
You talk about the words, the word disability. It's such an interesting word. Some people think it's a bad word. And I think that you actually had a Forbes article recently about privilege. It's not a dirty word. I wrote a similar piece like a month ago about disability is not a dirty word. And I think that, but to some people, it means something different. But I think when you talk to people and you ask people, what does it mean to you? It's going to change. You're going to learn a lot from that.
Absolutely. So often when we think about disabilities, we think about the ones that manifest outwardly. But approximately 1 in 10 people in the US have an invisible disability. Let's talk about some of the types of invisible disabilities, some common misconceptions, and how organizations can support people with invisible illnesses and invisible disabilities in the workplace.
Yeah, this is something that's, it's such a big thing that people aren't, invisible disabilities, it's so prevalent out there. And I would also include caregivers. I think this is a group of people we don't talk about often enough, are individuals who are taking care of a parent with a disability, a child with a disability, an aging parent. These are the type of people that are, they may not be disclosing it, but they're dealing with something that is very important. And companies need to be thinking about that. And again, making sure that you give a culture where people feel comfortable disclosing the fact that they have a disability. That's a really big challenge, and it's something that organizations all over the place are trying to work on right now. But when we think about that, because there's people who have chronic illnesses, and there's somebody who I've become really close with. Her name's Hannah Olson over at Chronically Capable, and she has a chronic Lyme disease, and she actually started Chronically Capable because she has this, when you see her, you wouldn't know, but she has this chronic Lyme disease and she needs to have a little bit extra time. But if companies and organizations aren't able to accommodate and adapt for that, you're missing out on some really great talent. And so, something to think about is those individuals who aren't disclosing, and you can create a culture of self-identification. And then also thinking about caregivers. I think those are two big pieces we need to think about.
You make such a powerful point. And when I was on a call, an executive committee meeting with an organization that I work with, and we were talking about the scarcity of talent in some of these major cities that we all work in and how competitive it is. So now think about if you're a leader and you create an organization that has more cultural competency, and you can now attract broader and better talent because you're being more thoughtful. And specifically, if someone is a caregiver, for example, then a flexible schedule is an incredible work-life integration benefit.
Yeah.
Because there's good days and bad days when you're working with someone that has disabilities, and you can't always predict that. But if you have the ability to work some from the office, work some at home, if you have the ability to do an excellent job, this isn't about lowering standards. This is about creating an environment where people can be their best. And as an employer, why would I want to work with someone or have somebody working for me that's been up all night taking care of a loved one when starting at 10 a.m. would be better for them? Right? That little point of grace, that little point of adaptation, if you will, of your calendar can allow that person to be productive at work, handle what they need to at home, but now you're a more attractive place for them to want to build their career.
Yeah, and that accommodation is actually going to help everybody, because you may have a temporary issue, right? But if we have that type of culture, that's why I often say is that often the accommodations and accessibility, it's not only going to help one group of people, it's going to help everyone.
That's right. Absolutely. And while we're on that point, let's talk about some of the assistive technologies that people with disabilities use and how those same technologies benefit all of us. So I'll throw that out to both of you.
Yeah, so I personally use a screen reader because I'm blind. I use a technology called a screen reader, which reads out the text on a screen to me. But what I also use is Siri quite a bit. And what people don't realize is that Siri is one of those assistive technologies that was designed for people with disabilities. But I know that everybody uses that technology now. Everyone uses it to, hey Siri, what's going on? I hope it doesn't go off. But it's hey Siri, what time is it? And these type of assistive technologies not only help one group of people, but it'll help a lot of people. And so the same thing goes to, recently I noticed that we have live transcription going on here. You may be in a loud situation. You may be with people around you talking and you can't hear us talking properly, but you may be able to now see and read the live transcription. And that's some really cool stuff out there right now.
I think you make a lot of really powerful points, John. The one thing I want to echo, right, is the fact that let's use websites that we frequent. When you design a better user experience for people with disabilities, that user experience extends to all of us and creates more stickiness to your content on your website, more conversions, which allows you to make more money, right? And so it's not just the accommodations for the accommodations' sake, but making things more equitable has an upside for all of us. And I think translating that to the business outcomes, I think is really, really important. And it's like, for me, someone that's very fortunate and is able to see, someone who has very strong hearing capability, I never thought about some of these things before. But now as a business leader that I do, right? Now it's my responsibility to ensure the areas that I can influence are better. The areas that I can influence and motivate people to take these better actions, that I push, that I prod, that I add that grace but firmness to the dialogues that I'm having. And so as we learn about disability and inclusion, right, it's very important to understand what is our responsibility as allies to make sure that our organizations are accountable, right? Not just to winning the press release about these things, but that we are actually making the changes within our organizations so that we all have that one voice of making a better way. And I think that's something that I'm learning and trying very hard to live.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Let's touch briefly on neurodiversity as part of disability inclusion. And here's where I'll share a little of my own story around dyslexia. So, growing up, I had some issues with reading and certainly with numbers. And it wasn't until college that I got tested and realized that I had dyslexia. But I didn't tell anyone. And John, to your earlier point of liability, no one that I ever worked for knew that until probably a year ago. I did an article for the National Diversity Council on dyslexia and said that I am, have dyslexia. But one of the things around dyslexia, and there's so much now that's being shared about how neurodiversity benefits innovation and creativity and problem solving. For me, because I think in a non-linear way, right? It's kind of, most people think in a step-by-step, very prescriptive way. And I'm kind of, all over the place, right? But it helps to vet ideas with my colleagues very quickly because I can very quickly identify issues and questions where, we might not have thought all the way through it yet. And so, I leverage that as a strength. But what are some of the ways that we can encourage people to share their neurodiversity so that it can be leveraged for innovation and creativity in the workplace?
Yeah, no, it's a great question because, people, and thank you for sharing, you being so open about it, because it's going to help other people, because I'm sure that a lot of people on this webinar and who hear this may not have known that, and you sharing your story is going to open that up for others. So thank you for that. But I talk about, people with disabilities are some of the greatest problem solvers, just like you talked about. You think differently, and what organization doesn't want a problem solver? Because when I think about it myself, the boundaries that are there to do something, I couldn't always I couldn't do it the way that you're supposed to. So I had to figure out different ways of coming up with solutions to get things done. And so if we can, encourage people to think outside of that, don't think outside the box, and let people have their own, think the way that you do, creating that culture. It goes back to a culture of allowing people the opportunity to be open about it and say, hey, this is how I learned. Because when you allow people to say, you openly talk about it, your other folks will kind of give you that space. They can understand, like, oh, I need to give a little bit more time. I need to not overwhelm with many questions. Maybe I can back off a little bit and, ask more, kind of probe it a little bit differently, different types of questioning and the way I speak. And I think that's going to allow people then to be able to come up with unique solutions that not everyone else may have been able to think of. But it just really comes to me. It always goes back to that culture piece, allowing people to be open about it, and then you're going to see this problem solving that comes out, because we just don't know how to sometimes work within the set guidelines, and that's what sparks innovation, when other people can build on top of that.
Yeah, the thing I would share, a lot of times we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, we talk about disabilities and inclusion, and these are powerful things. Mm-hmm. We also have to remember, in order to make an organization grow and sustain that growth, culture drives growth. And in order to have a great culture, you have to have excellent leaders. And being a quality leader means that you're giving people space to share things that are affecting them. And so when we talk about these invisible things that are going on, I'll just give an example. There was a colleague in one of my firms that I'm leading, and they were going through a divorce. Now, I'm not equating a divorce to a disability. I'm equating a divorce to something that you would not see, something invisible, but that affects how that person can show up at work. But if you as a leader don't know that information, you have to ask yourself, why I don't know some of these things about my team. Do you have that openness where people feel safe, that they can share things that they're working through, that they're working on, or they can share a disability that they have, and feel comfort that you're going to support them, not penalize them? And most people hold things in because they think there's going to be a penalty for being transparent. And so as a leader, we have to make sure that we create an environment. And again, we're talking about disabilities. I brought in someone's personal situation, but that goes to show that if we can create that openness and that safe space, that applies to people with disabilities and those that don't, because we all have things in our lives that affect us in showing up in our best place at work. And as leaders, we need to create environments where not only are we able to listen to that, hear that, when people have the trust to share it, but that our actions show that we're going to keep the standard high, but we're going to give people the support they need to meet those standards, right? And that's a part of building a winning culture.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So we're going to transition into some questions from the Q&A. There's some great questions in here already. If you've not submitted your question, please go ahead and submit that, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. The first question is, what's the most inclusive way to ask about ability in the demographic section of a DEI survey?
Oh, um, one thing that I would think about is, is asking for, again, maybe I'm trying to get a better understanding. It's just asking the question about what disabilities people have, or in terms of accommodations. But I can kind of break it down into two pieces, right? So I think that one is asking people what type of disabilities. We break it down into kind of four major categories of cognitive, um, physical or mobility challenge disabilities, visual and auditory. And then when we start to think about the accommodations, that's another way to ask people other ways of if they need any, if they identify with the disability. But I hope I answered that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, John, the one thing that I would add to that is, you want to first establish a culture of inclusion and a culture that encourages employees to be open to share that information, right? We talked about that a little bit. And, if you create that culture of inclusion and explain why you want the information so that you can then provide the assistive technologies and accessibility requirements that a person needs to do their best work, that's a great place to start, and allows people to be more open about the type of information that they feel comfortable disclosing.
The other thing I would add to that point is that is also a good use case for anonymous surveys, because as an employer, when you're just getting your team used to having these discussions, you just want to know the things you need to provide better. The actual example of the who is not as critical in the beginning, right? You want to understand the demographics and the makeup of your team so that you can add more of those accommodations smartly as you decide on a new facility, as you bring in a speaker, as you have a webinar and turn transcription on, right? Things like that you can just be better in a kind of a stair-step way. And then as you start to build more and more trust in the organization, you're going to have more manager conversations with their teams where the individual conversations will occur. But I think that's a good example for anonymous surveys where you can just get a better understanding of how we can do things a little bit more appropriate for the broad construct of our team.
Yeah, and I think that gets me thinking about something. One of the things that I often talk about, asking accommodations on a Zoom interview, right? You have all the information you're asking people, your name, your email address, but then asking, do you need any accommodations? And then when somebody comes into your front lobby of your office, everybody asking, oh, do you need any accommodations? The moment we make it that we treat everyone has a disability or may or not, I think that's also going to start that cultural change, that people they won't think you're kind of isolating individuals, but you're really just trying to change the culture.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Another question, how would an organization go about searching for leaders with disabilities?
Yeah, so there's a couple of, at least from my perspective, there's a few organizations, a lot of organizations that are doing great things. Even the state of North Carolina. Man, we start with services for the blind or vocational rehab. And, North Carolina in 2019 became an employee first state where they wanted to make sure that the state of North Carolina was employing people with disabilities. So they're working on doing a lot of great stuff to make sure that they're building in homegrown talent here in North Carolina, making sure that these individuals with disabilities are being given opportunities. And that really goes back to also what we're trying to do with Abler Works. We're trying to make sure that we're training up the workforce, getting people with disabilities trained up with the skills that they need to get into the workforce, because we see this as a supply and demand. What we're doing with the course, with putting on tap talent to work, is making sure that companies are ready. But as companies get ready, we want to make sure that the talent pool is ready to fill those needs. And so it's a two-sided of the table we have to address, supply and demand, and we're working on both sides of that. But there's also organizations like Chronically Capable, as I mentioned, with Hannah Olson, who's just another great resource with her platform, which is a job portal. But if you really want to start here in North Carolina, I'd say start with the state, with vocational rehab and services for blind, and then of course, Able Works is also another great resource.
One thing that I would add to that, as you're attracting people to your organization, people do their research. And so if a person of color, for example, goes to a website of a company and they don't see anyone in leadership that looks like them, that doesn't necessarily make them feel comfortable. So people ask, well, what if we do have a homogeneous team? What do we do in the interim? Well, what kind of organizations do you support? What kind of organizations do you partner with? And when people are doing the research and they see the outreach of your company, the outreach of your team, they're going to naturally understand that, wait a minute, this organization may not be everything it wants in terms of disability inclusion, but the effort is there. The goal and the focus is there. And people give a lot for progress, even though none of us are perfect.
Yeah. And also, for one other piece on that is, even in your own organization, you may have people with disabilities who just haven't disclosed. So as you're looking for talent, it may be inside your own organization already. You just need to build that. Make sure that culture is there that people want to disclose.
Awesome.
The next question is, if you suspect that you have a team member that needs support due to a possible disability, how do you approach that person to offer support? The concern there is around crossing the line from an HR legal perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one of those situations where, I think DT, you talked about it, right? Asking people about, asking if you can provide any support, or asking accommodations. It's having that conversation of asking if somebody needs something, but it's having that conversation, at least in my perspective, me having talking to teammates and asking if there's any accommodation I can provide you. And if you don't single out an individual, you ask everybody, it makes it gives that opportunity to really kind of find out if everyone feels comfortable, because somebody may not be feeling comfortable today to talk about it, but they may be feeling comfortable if you're, maybe in a week or so. But it's the same thing. I talk to, education providers, where we go through in the syllabus of, of your course syllabus, you say, oh, does anyone need an accommodation? But it's almost as a checkbox. But if you ask every day, oh, do you need any accommodations? Let us know. Then it opens that up a little bit more.
The other thing I would add to that is give people multiple folks that they can talk with about it, or multiple ways that they can express it. So for example, as a leader, I encourage other leaders to have either weekly town halls or monthly town halls with their teams. That's a good chance for a leader to say, listen, if anyone needs any accommodations, talk to your HR representative, talk to your manager, right? Send a note, right, to me as the leader, or write a little note in crayon and slide it under my door, right? You just want to create that environment that you just want the information so that you can be helpful and better. Because there may be someone that is not as comfortable telling their direct manager, but will share it with HR, right? That'll share it with a colleague, and they can at least make a recommendation on their behalf. You just want to create that you're not concerned with the proper channel all the time. You just want to get that information to leadership so that we can be better.
Awesome. The next question is, what are some of the biggest challenges in educating people who may not be informed about people and professionals with disabilities? What advice do you give for people that are looking for how to educate others?
I'll start on this one, and then John,
Yeah.
you can finish, because I'm the uninitiated, right? Like I had the furthest kind of path to go as we started this DEI work. I always learn best from people that don't make me feel bad for not knowing. So one of the things that's really important is that when you're teaching or encouraging people to learn things new, we have to give each other grace, right, to practice without penalty, right? To where when we don't say something exactly right, or I'm still working on saying everyone versus you guys and the DEI speak, different things like that. We have to all learn and grow, but we also have to have the ability to learn and grow together, right? So number one is the way that knowledge comes across. The second thing is to make things that are video-based or readings available because if I am learning something new and I'm a little uncomfortable about it, I like to do my research in private. I like to read something. I like to look at a quick video, and then I can ask better formed questions in public. And so we want to make sure that we're not just having a seminar for the company. Here's how we need to think about disabilities, but we have things that people can consume privately, both video, written form, snippet videos, so that I have a lot of resources as a new learner that fit into the way my learning style shows up in the workplace.
Yeah, those are great because, you know, as you were talking about it, DT, I was thinking about my co-founder, Mike Iannelli, and Mike and I spending time together and having those conversations and creating a space for us both to have a conversation, because he's relatively new to the disability community, and, you know, learning about, you know, myself, and just us having that conversation. And I think that really goes a long way, is, again, going back to proximity builds empathy, because he doesn't know what he doesn't know, and I don't know what I don't know, unless we spend time with other people and talking and having those conversations. But we need to make sure that we have that kind of have that safe environment, and that's something that Mike and I have, is we've built this trust with each other. We can have these type of discussions about having he can ask me questions. When we walk together, whether it be with Mike, how to guide me, right? He's asking those questions. But I've seen that change over the year ago when we met to now, where he's asking questions, even, you know, before, where he would grab my arm. Now he's asking questions. But I think it really comes back to proximity builds empathy, and having those discussions. And you can do that within your own organization with employee resource groups, which could then create those environments where people with different abilities can talk. And there's a lot of cool stuff you can do.
Absolutely. The next question is, being the mom of 2 young adults with disabilities, any advice for them starting off their grown-up careers? Both are recent grads.
Yeah. One thing, I mean, on my personal side, my parents, I have 2 loving parents, and I'm very privileged to have that. And I'm so thankful. And, one of the things that they did was they never, they let me fail, and they let me move forward, right? They didn't put limitations on what I was able to do. And I think that, as you have 2 young rising employees, or people who are going to enter the workforce, is encouraging them, just be there, and not putting limitations on them, but letting them, experience their own journey, right? And also equipping them with how to be their own advocates. Because what I did not learn was how to be an advocate for myself. But if they can learn how to advocate for themselves and ask questions and ask for accommodations, feel that comfort, and help educate other people sometimes, because everyone's on their own disability inclusion journey. And if we can help other people by sharing our stories and being open about things, we're going to get some changes that way. But I encourage you to empower them to not be afraid to fail, and not be afraid to share their stories, because you're going to see a lot of great things that come out of that.
For me, I have a friend that her son had a disability, and we hired him as an intern. And this was many, many years ago. And now he's graduating from Arizona State. He has an amazing job with Adobe Systems out of San Jose. And what I would share from my perspective is, don't let a disability keep you from dreaming amazing dreams. That there are people out there, there's allies, there are opportunities that are that will help accelerate you and won't hold you back. So don't allow a negative narrative about what you can be define you, because there's examples in people that want to support you, that want to be a part of your journey, and the best is yet to come. And so when I'm thinking about this young man and some of the challenges that he had to overcome, but now that he's done so, the warrior that he is in the workplace, so to speak, and he is crushing it, right? But he needed people to give him a chance. He needed people that understood some accommodations. But once those things were made, he did not need handholding. His star began to shine. And it's just so great that a lot of companies out there are starting to be much more open. And I think it's a better time than it was 10 years ago, 5 years ago, with disabilities, just like it is from a diversity, equity, inclusion standpoint. We're not everywhere we need to be, but we're in a better place than we have in years past.
But DT, one of the as you share that story, one of the things that really it's going to benefit his career is that the fact that you gave him an internship, right? So, he has actual work experience.
That's right.
And that's something that, a lot of people with disabilities, they're just looking for that chance to get build out their resume. And I think that you giving that opportunity to that individual is huge, right? You help build that confidence for him. And I think that building confidence is such a big thing. And I'm sure he would also, just knowing who you are and what you've done for me, I know that you help. I can only imagine that you help build his confidence, and that's huge. And by giving them the internship, that's a big thing.
Thank you both for sharing that. And thank you for all of the amazing questions in the Q&A. There are so many, we can't get to all of them, unfortunately, today, but we enjoyed answering those questions. Don and John, thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your expertise, and your insights with us today. And thank you all for attending Leveling Up Your Workforce Through Disability Inclusion. To learn more about our new course, Disability Inclusion, Putting Untapped Talent to Work, go to thediversitymovement.com. You can also go to abler360.com and look out for a special discount offer in the follow-up email from this webinar. Remember, April is Celebrate Diversity Month, so kudos for making this a part of your diversity education journey. I encourage you all to keep it going through the back half of the month, sharing as you go. And mark your calendar for the Diversity Movement's next free webinar, How Inclusivity Promotes Equitable Healthcare Outcomes for Black and Indigenous People of Color, on Thursday, May 4th, hosted by our CEO and one of today's guests, Donald Thompson. At the end of this webinar, you'll see a 2-question survey appear in your browser. We welcome your feedback and ask you to please take a minute to answer so that we can continue to provide valuable free programming. Thank you all so much for spending this hour with us, and I hope that you enjoy your day.
Thanks, team. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.